I think I'd have to say that at the moment, animal testing is a necessary evil for medical advancement, and that people who deny that animal research has any validity are being blinded by their own prejudice into believing what they want to be true. And they do this by picking examples where animal research hasn't fared too well and just ignoring the vast majority of cases where it's been extremely effective. And that approach is called cherry picking, and that's something that most of us are quite familiar with. As for those animal activists who believe that we're involved in some kind of war and that there will be casualties arising from this war, these people are fanatics, and one of the common key characteristics of fanatics is that they believe they are totally justified by the righteousness of their cause to commit any atrocity against anyone. And that sounds kind of familiar too. So, is animal testing ever justified? And I would have to say yes, where it's necessary to save or improve the quality of human life. And the argument that this is focused solely on the welfare of human beings, whilst having some truth, isn't an argument that would sway me against animal experimentation. And that's because I believe that a human life is worth more than that of an animal. So for me the choice is clear. For those who feel differently, then I'd ask how many of these people who protest against experiments on animals would give their child or accept for themselves a vaccine or medical treatment, which is only possible through the results arising from animal experimentation. And I think that the answer to that is, if I had to hazard a guess, quite a few. I was intrigued by your reference to the article about MS and a vegan diet, and so I had a read of it. Didn't follow up on any of the references since you said you'd already done that, but there were a few things that struck me straight away about the phrasing and the presentation of this article. And the first is the following quote: "Nevertheless, when I ask physicians and dietitians for hard evidence proving that diet has nothing to do with the cause or cure of MS, they consistently come up empty-handed. I have yet to see a study that says diet will not help MS victims." And this struck me as being the same kind of argument that's used time and again to support other claims, where the proponent really wants the claim to be true, but there's very little evidence to support it. There's a definite similarity here to "you can't prove that God or UFOs or Bigfoot or the Loch Ness Monster or pixies don't exist." But science doesn't work that way. If anyone was making a definite statement that diet has no effect on MS, then obviously they need to provide evidence to back up that claim. But that isn't really the claim that's being made. All that's being said is that there isn't any evidence to show that diet can treat MS effectively. So it's the people claiming that the low-fat, meat-free diet is an effective treatment or preventative measure for MS are the ones who have to provide evidence to support their claim. And also the claim that the strongest contact we have with our environment is our daily food intake is questionable. We breathe more than we eat, for example. And I think I could easily argue that in the developed world we have access to clean, treated water. And therefore I could propose that untreated water, often contaminated with raw sewage, must help prevent or treat MS, owing to the low incidence of MS in the third world. So if you want a cure, or you want to reduce the likelihood of contracting MS, then the best thing to do is take a sip of the toilet bowl water before it gets flushed. Alternatively, the most obvious reason that occurred to me for the low incidence of MS in poor Asian and African countries is the standard of medical care that's available to the general populace. MS probably just isn't diagnosed. I'm not sure that the example of Japan as being a nation that doesn't have a diet heavy in animal foods is valid either. My understanding is that they do have a diet that's very high in fish. there's also some evidence that fish oils do help maintain healthy nerve and brain function, so there could be something in that. But there could also be genetic, racial factors in play here. You know, we've got people who live in Western Europe, white Europeans, who are tolerant to lactose, which is found in cow's milk. That's quite rare amongst human beings. And you have incidents of sickle cell anemia in black Africans and their descendants. The reference to Roy Swank's work also rang alarm bells for me because it seemed to be incomplete. It doesn't make any reference to other improvements for the treatment and care of people with MS. And I think that it's reasonable to assume that the patients that are mentioned in these studies or records or whatever also received improved medical treatments during the period that's being referenced. And where are any kind of control data for the claims that are being made? All it says is that the advancement of the disease slowed. Well, over the period being quoted, that's probably true of most people with MS, as the medical treatment of the condition was improved. The idea that doctors would not propose a low-fat diet because it's too difficult to follow is ridiculous, because doctors propose drastic dietary changes to patients all the time for blood pressure, obesity, heart disease, high cholesterol, diabetes, and so on. Cutting down the amount of fat would definitely be something they would suggest would be a good idea if there's evidence to back it up. The whole article struck me as being biased towards backing up a foregone conclusion rather than demonstrating how this conclusion was drawn from any kind of evidence. And we see similar claims for other snake oil products as well, things like homeopathy and crystal healing or faith healing and the treatments offered by Scientology and that sort of stuff. And what I find so dangerous about these ideas is that people may often forego an effective treatment in preference to taking the snake oil. And even worse is when enough people believe this rubbish, it becomes mainstream so that there's potential for it to be offered as an alternative therapy, sometimes even on the NHS. So I end up paying for this quackery through my taxes. And even worse still, it might even be seen as a viable alternative and dispensed instead of conventional medicine, because let's face it, it's cheaper to dangle a piece of quartz and a couple of eagle feathers over someone's head than it is to dose them up with anti-cancer drugs. And I think that the reason for this article's approach, and articles like it, is that for many people who oppose testing on animals, it's a moral, emotional judgment rather than one that's based on any kind of rational analysis. Now, there are some people who consider that the value of an animal is on par with the value of human life. I do not. If somebody believes very strongly in animal rights and they don't want to eat meat or use animal products or use any kind of treatment that's been tested on animals or arisen from research that's done through experimentation on animals, then obviously that's their right to make that decision. But it's not their right to make that choice for the rest of us.